Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this second of our Zoom lectures for this semester from the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society here at King's. For those people who don't know me, I'm Mark Pennington. I'm the director of the centre. One of the key themes that we are looking at the CSGS is the epistemic role that different kind of institutional arrangements play. And because of that, I'm delighted to say that today we're joined by Jeffrey Friedman, who's currently a visiting scholar at Harvard University. Jeff is the editor of the journal Critical Review. And I think over the last 15, 20 years, perhaps even longer than that, through that journal and other outlets, he's really done more than anybody, in my view, to explore these questions about the epistemic properties of different sorts of institutional arrangements. And I think that's exemplified wonderfully in his new book with Oxford University Press, Power Without Knowledge, which came out a few months ago, which I heartily recommend to everybody. Today, though, he's going to talk to us about populists as technocrats. He'll probably speak for about 45 minutes, maybe a little bit longer. And we'd invite you to submit your questions in written form, either during the talk or after the talk. But we're not actually going to have interruptions during the presentation itself. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Jeff Friedman to give his presentation. Welcome, Jeff.
Thank you, Mark. I was happy when this was scheduled to occur after the election so that whatever I said about populism wouldn't immediately be falsified by whatever happened on election day. I would say that nothing has happened to falsify what I'm going to say. Nothing has particularly happened to confirm it. The confirmation, such as it is, the evidence that I'll present came earlier. But I do think that as advertised in the abstract of the talk that some of you may have seen, populism is not the only game in town. And in fact, technocracy, which I'm going to quite counterintuitively portray as the superset that contains populism as a subset, technocracy is not the only game in town. And I do think that is something that is beginning to be reflected in the election results in the United States. So I hope at the end of the talk to briefly say a few words about other kinds of politics than the one that I'm going to be talking about, which is technocratic politics in general and populist politics in particular. Before I get to my rationale for that very counterintuitive placement of populism as a subset of technocracy, I want to just say a few minutes worth of words about the methodology that I'll be using, which is the methodology of intellectual charity. And then I also hope to come back to that at the very end of the talk, because to me, that's really the most interesting upshot of the research that I did for, during those 20 years that Mark referred to, reflected the research I was doing partly was just from reading Critical Review, editing the articles that appeared in Critical Review during those 2 decades of its epistemological focus. But I was also writing this book that Mark referred to in those 2 decades, Power Without Knowledge. And by the time I finished writing the book last year, I had concluded that the really interesting thing, at least to me, is not so much the institutional upshot of epistemology, political epistemology, but the methodological upshot of it, which is, as I see it, intellectual charity. Intellectual charity does have a lot of political consequences, perhaps. But what I'll focus on, to the extent that I have time for it here at the beginning and at the end, are the methodological implications. Then after that introduction, I will move on to theoretical rationale for seeing populists as technocrats. Then the fun part of the talk will be I will run through 7 traits of populists, recognizable traits in the ordinary way that people think about populism and talk about populism, that I think can be better explained through this technocratic lens than through other more conventional approaches to understanding populism. And then I'll close out with, if time allows, with a few words about technocracy and other forms of politics, and again, about the methodological implications of intellectual charity. So the talk itself will be a purported demonstration of the merits of intellectual charity as a social science methodology, and then I'll reflect, if I have time, on what broader implications we can draw from the talk to the extent that it is successful. Okay, intellectual charity as a method. I may be making a mistake by opening with an example that will be much better known to my British audience than it is to myself, to me myself. But when I was writing an article, there's also an article in Critical Review called Populists as Technocrats that contains a lot of the evidence that I'll be presenting and more if you want to look it up. When I was writing that article, I couldn't help constantly running into the example of Michael Gove's Declaration of Independence from expertise, which, at least in the United States, is commonly portrayed as an example of the post-truth nature of populism, and more important for my purposes, as indicating the irrationality of populists, because Gove was interpreted as rejecting not only science, but facts, knowledge, and reason itself. And if that isn't irrational, it's hard to imagine what is. But my experience in researching populism in the United States, meaning reading about Trump supporters, Trump statements from Trump himself, reading about Trump's predecessor in 1992, Ross Perot, who actually almost won the presidency back then, more than 20 years before Trump did, led me to expect that this understanding of what Michael Gove said might be too intellectually uncharitable. So I looked it up, found it on YouTube, and I'll read you what he actually said. The people in this country have had enough of experts from organizations with acronyms saying that they know what is best and getting it consistently wrong, because these people are the same ones who've got consistently wrong what's been happening. These are people who have done very well, thank you, out of the European Union. One of the striking things about this debate is that those who are asking that we remain have a vested financial interest in staying in the European Union. So it seems to me that from the context, the immediate context of the rest of his remarks in this interview, what Gove was actually doing was not rejecting knowledge, reason, science, facts. He was rejecting false knowledge claims as he saw them, and bogus science as he saw it. And that puts quite a different cast on things, because first of all, it suggests that, at least in this case, the populist leader, or the populist politician, I should just say, is not articulating an irrational stance, even if you disagree with it and think he's simply mistaken about whether the experts from acronymic organizations were wrong. Even if you think he's wrong in saying that their knowledge claims were incorrect, it doesn't seem at all clear to me that he was irrationally articulating the view that no knowledge claims can be correct or something like that, as the cliche about him has it, at least in the United States. From this one little example, and in a way the rest of my remarks will be will be elaborating other examples of how you can see populists if you simply try to put yourself in their shoes and understand why they might do what they do and believe what they believe from their own perspective, meaning a perspective in which they do not view themselves as irrational. I don't think it's possible for anyone to view him or herself as irrational about a particular action that he or she is taking or a particular belief that he or she holds. We may say, oh yes, we're all irrational because we've read Freud or we've just been acculturated in a climate that's been heavily influenced by Freud and by more contemporary forms of social psychology for decades and decades. But none of us can say this belief that I have is irrational. If you thought that, you wouldn't be able to hold on to the belief anymore. So intellectual charity, meaning putting yourself into the shoes of the other, or what Weber called Verstehen, I think entails that we not interpret others as irrational. And as soon as you do that, as soon as you try to understand them as they would rationalistically understand themselves, insights begin to appear that will not appear if you write them off as being irrational. You can write them off as being mistaken, but you won't understand them as well if you do that. And in this case, I think that means you won't understand populism as well as if you just try to get yourself inside the heads of populists. So what I'm going to do now is try to provide an intellectually charitable interpretation of populism in general. And I will keep coming back to the Gove example occasionally to illustrate it. This wider perspective on populism begins with this controversial move that I make at the beginning of my book, where I define technocracy to include ordinary people, not just experts. The conventional definition of technocracy, of course, is rule by experts. Or in the contemporary parlance of political theory, that translates into rule by what we call epistocrats, those who know. There are two components of this then. One is a recognition that technocracy is a fundamentally epistemic project, because the epistocrats, the experts, are experts by virtue of knowing something that is important enough to qualify them to have political power, either the power of influential advisors to politicians or the power of actually making decisions, for example, in regulatory agencies, such as the Fed in the United States. So the conventional definition recognizes that technocracy is fundamentally an epistemic project, but it also claims or implies that what needs to be known in a technocracy is esoteric knowledge and therefore is only accessible to experts, not to ordinary people. Now, in order to challenge that assumption, not in the sense that I'm saying in reality the knowledge is accessible to ordinary people, but rather to challenge the assumption that everybody agrees that the knowledge is only accessible to experts. We have to figure out what this knowledge is. What is it that epistocrats or technocrats who are experts, what is it that they are supposed to know? We can talk about this more, of course, in the question period, but I will just assert that what really the experts at the Fed, the experts at the FTC, the politicians who claim expertise in the sense that they deliver plans to us for helping us. What they have in common is that they are trying to solve or prevent or ameliorate social and economic problems. That may sound vague, but the social and economic problems are usually seen as things such as poverty, low wages, high unemployment rates, crime, business cycles. What these classic social and economic problems have in common, I think, is that they are negative utilitarian. In other words, they are problems in the sense that they cause suffering or unpleasantness for people. And they're materialistic in the sense that this suffering or unpleasantness is tangible. And therefore, the knowledge that technocrats have, in the conventional usage, that means the knowledge that experts have, is supposed to be knowledge of how to achieve the tangible result of solving, ameliorating, or preventing these problems. I'll just say solving from now on for the sake of convenience. I'll say solving social problems instead of solving, ameliorating, or preventing social and economic problems. So by implication, the knowledge that epistocrats, or in ordinary usage technocrats, are supposed to have is knowledge of how to predict and control human behavior, because human actions are usually the causes of people's social and economic problems. And this, I think, is why the conventional view is that technocracy is a fundamentally elitist project as well as a fundamentally epistemic project, because it's social scientific elites who claim that they have the knowledge of how to solve, alleviate, and prevent social and economic problems by controlling and predicting human behavior. Social science is the attempt to predict human behavior, and in disciplines that have policy relevance, such as economics, that turns into the knowledge, or the putative knowledge, of how not only to predict human behavior, but control human behavior by predicting how people will react to a proposed technocratic intervention that is designed to solve, alleviate, or prevent a social problem. So from the epistemic project, we move in the conventional view to the conclusion that that technocratic knowledge must be esoteric, because social scientists have some kind of esoteric knowledge of how to predict and control human behavior. This is exactly, I think, one of the things that populists contest when they think, as Gove professed to think, that the people themselves know how to solve social and economic problems, or that at least the people in retrospect can judge the efforts of technocratic elites to have failed, such that the people can choose a different policy in response to the failure, such as Brexit. So the reason that I think it's very important to include populists as a subset of technocracy along with epistocrats, rather to include citizens, ordinary citizens along with epistocrats, is that you do have this contestation all the time about whether the people know what they need to know in order to solve social and economic problems. And in fact, I think it's really the default assumption that the people know that, because otherwise, why would the people have to be involved in politics at all? We usually live in democratic technocracies. China and Singapore, perhaps, are counterexamples, but in most places, technocracy is democratic in the sense either that the people themselves are relied upon to make policy judgments, as when in many states in the United States, they can actually impose a policy through a referendum, or the people are passing judgment on politicians who make technocratic claims, such as this policy will help to solve your problems. Or there's a mixture. We can have a mixed regime, and I think we usually do have mixed regimes in which both social science experts and ordinary people make knowledge claims. So whichever side in these contestations, when they turn into contestations between experts and ordinary people, whichever side is right, I think we have to recognize that empirically, it is not taken for granted by most people that only experts have relevant technocratic knowledge, meaning relevant knowledge of how to solve, prevent, or alleviate social and economic problems. What then are the epistemological assumptions and the ontological assumptions even of allowing that ordinary people have the requisite knowledge? Well, first let's look just very quickly at some of the epistemological and ontological assumptions that experts have when they think that they have the requisite technocratic knowledge. Take economics, for example. There are basically two wings of economics, although they often intermingle increasingly in recent decades. There's the a prioristic wing, which is exemplified by neoclassical economic theory, where experts think that they can predict and therefore, by implication, control human behavior through theoretical knowledge of the implications of rational choice theory, essentially. Then there's a positivist path to esoteric technocratic knowledge, where you try, for example, to correlate statistically measurable factors, independent variables, with human behavior in such a way that you can predict the human behavior and control it. Or you perform randomized controlled trials and so on. Now, both the a prioristic path and the positivistic path to knowledge, they're both esoteric paths. And this is what justifies the tacit belief among experts that they, and perhaps they alone, have technocratic knowledge. There's also, in addition to that epistemological, esoteric implication, there is an ontological implication, which is that in some sense, society or human behavior must be complex, such that we need some kind of elaborate theory or some kind of elaborate empirical evidence that isn't gatherable just by looking around, as an ordinary citizen can do, in order to understand society or in order to understand or predict human behavior. So in contrast, I think it's clear that citizen technocrats, as I will call them, must have epistemological and ontological assumptions that are anti-esotericist and anti-complexity. Only anti-esoteric epistemological assumptions and anti-complexity ontological assumptions would produce the assumption that the people are qualified to participate in technocratic politics. Michael Gove said elsewhere in that interview, "I'm not asking the people to trust me, I'm asking them to trust themselves, because I have faith in the people to make the right decisions." Now, this is a very, very common trope, not just among populists, but among everybody really, in our technocratic regimes, our mixed technocratic regimes. And it's what justifies allowing people to play any role at all, whether directly through initiatives or indirectly by electing presidents and legislators who in turn create technocratic policies or appoint the heads of technocratic bureaucracies, epistocratic bureaucracies. Where could the assumption that the people can make the right technocratic decisions come from? There are a couple of possible answers. I'm going to focus on only one, which is the cultural answer. By culture, I mean that there are ideas in circulation that are either explicitly in circulation or that are implicit in other ideas and practices, such as the practice of asking for popular approval of technocratic politicians and technocratic policies. For example, there's a whole school of what are called in the United States kitchen table politicians. They're also sometimes called pragmatic politicians. People like Joe Biden, in the last presidential cycle, Amy Klobuchar was one, even Elizabeth Warren was one, who directly appeal to common sense solutions or plans that voters are supposed to evaluate on the basis of whether they are indeed commonsensical solutions to social and economic problems. So when you are addressed by these politicians and are being asked by them to evaluate whether the politicians are worth voting for on the basis of their commonsensical plans or solutions, the implication is that you know how to judge whether the solutions will work, meaning that you know how, that you in effect have adequate technocratic knowledge yourself. And the other implication is that the world is simple enough that you could have such knowledge without any esoteric training in statistics or neoclassical economic theory. There's also the more general, at least in the United States, the more general civic teaching that the responsible citizen studies up on the issues and decides who to vote for on the basis of whether they agree with their platforms, as we say, their policy platforms, their stances on the issues. So if you are responsible, you will gather knowledge that enables you to evaluate these stances on the issues. And that again means that by reading a newspaper or watching CNN or something that doesn't involve esoteric knowledge, you will be able to gather commonsensical technocratic knowledge. I'm going to call this implicit epistemology, I'm just going to call it naive technocratic realism. Lee Ross and Andrew Ward, in a paper from 1996 called Naive Realism in Everyday Life, define naive realism as the view that I see things as they are. That is, that my beliefs, preferences, and resulting responses follow from an essentially unmediated perception of relevant stimuli and unmediated incorporation of relevant evidence. The key term is unmediated, because if we allow that our ideas about social problems and how to solve them, for example, are mediated by human theories, human data gathering, and so forth, then we're allowing for error to enter in, so that the conclusions that we reach about these things are not self-evident conclusions. We may think that they are warranted conclusions, but they're not self-evident. The naive realist thinks that the conclusions that he or she draws about whatever domain we're talking about are self-evident. So naive technocratic realism amounts to the claim that truths about technocratic issues are pretty much self-evident if you can count reading the newspaper or watching CNN as getting the self-evident truth. So that's the epistemology of citizen technocracy, naive technocratic realism. The ontology is that social problems are easy not just to understand, but to solve. In Trump's first address to Congress in 2017, just after he was inaugurated, he said, "Everything that is broken in our country can be fixed. Every problem can be solved." Ironically, the day before this address, he had remarked off the cuff to reporters when he was engaged in negotiations about what to do about healthcare, a classic technocratic problem. He said, "Nobody knew healthcare could be so complicated." But I don't think that these two statements, separated by 24 hours, are really inconsistent with each other. Because I think what he's saying in the State of the Union, or not the State of the Union, but the address to Congress, is that the problems can be solved. Every problem can be solved because they can be easily understood. And that's why it's surprising that one of these problems, healthcare, could be so complicated. Let me quote another populist leader, Viktor Orban. I'm not sure, I can't remember whether this is before he was elected, when he was first campaigning, or afterwards. But early in his premiership, he said, the alternatives in front of us are obvious. We need to understand that for rebuilding the economy, it is not theories that are needed, but rather 30 robust lads who can start working to implement what we all know needs to be done. So the ontology and the epistemology are neatly wrapped up by both Trump and Orban for us. So that's the epistemology and the ontology that we get from citizen technocracy, and that I think populism is simply a distillation of. Meaning that populists are people who tend just to view things through this citizen technocratic lens, without any admixtures of, say, having majored in social science in college, so that they might begin to think that perhaps technocratic knowledge isn't self-evident and needs to be gathered through esoteric means. Now I can begin listing these 7 populist traits that can be understood through the lens of citizen technocratic epistemology and ontology, the epistemology of naive technocratic realism, and the ontology of a simple society or simple human behavior. The first is what Orban just expressed, anti-intellectualism. I will get immediately to Gove-type repudiation of intellectuals. I simply mean a kind of dismissal of the need for intellectuals to begin with, because we know what needs to be done, so we can stop debating, we can stop arguing, and we can stop thinking, really, and just get on to acting. A second populist trait that I think is illuminated by the epistemology and the ontology is a type of conspiracy theorizing. I'll be giving 2 types of conspiracy theorizing in succession, but the first is the type that Gove was engaged in, conspiracy theorizing about epistemic elites. The basic question here, or the basic unsolvable problem for someone who is a naive technocratic realist, is how can this person explain errors, technocratic errors? How can we explain failures to understand the self-evident truth? Really, if the truth is self-evident, then nobody can fail to understand it. So what looks like a technocratic error, a failure to understand, can't really be a failure to understand. It must be a lie. People who claim that they don't understand something, or people who claim that a technocratic policy will produce X when it's self-evident that it will produce Y, or people who claim that a technocratic policy has produced X when it's self-evident that it produced Y, they must be lying. They couldn't really be simply mistaken, because the truth is self-evident. And if the truth is self-evident, nobody can be mistaken about it. So the so-called experts, given that they are wrong, and given that their wrongness is self-evident, must really be a sort of conspiracy of liars. And so then all you need to do is infer what their motive for lying is. And usually the motive is self-interest, which is what Gove was saying. Because these people had self-interest in staying in the EU, they lied about what the results of Brexit would be. That's conspiracy theorizing about epistemic elites, but that in turn is a subset of a broader tendency among populists to come up with or believe in conspiracy theories about political elites in general, which can include not just experts, but politicians who don't even claim to listen to experts. Here we have the ontological version of the epistemological conundrum that leads to conspiracy theorizing about epistemic elites. Conspiracy theorizing about political elites, I think, comes out of the fact that a naive technocratic realist can no more explain technocratic failure than she can explain technocratic error in the sense of failure to understand. Failure to implement a productive policy is just as inexplicable as failure to understand what a productive policy would be, if the truth about the results of the policy would be self-evident or are self-evident. So in this view, all that a politician needs to do in order to solve a social and economic problem is intend to solve it. And on the whole, that should lead to success, because problems are simple enough that it's easy to know how to solve them. So if you intend to solve them, the knowledge will follow as a matter of course, and the problem will be solved eventually. But when problems persist, that creates a problem for the naive technocratic realist, and the explanation is that the politician must not really want to solve the problem. There's a wonderful book, and it's really the only social science in any conventional sense that I can refer to that helps to explicate populism in the way that I'm trying to explicate it. It's John Hibbing and Elizabeth Theis-Morse's 1995 book, Congress as Public Enemy. There's also a 2002 follow-up book, Stealth Democracy. In the 1995 book, Hibbing and Theis-Morse happened to be in the field conducting survey research and focus groups during Ross Perot's first populist presidential campaign. So they ended up interviewing and listening to discussions among all sorts of Perot voters. And a common theme among them was that all it would take to solve America's social and economic problems would be for the two parties' leaders to get together and say to each other, quote, this is from one of their respondents, "There's a problem. We won't leave this room until it's fixed." Another one then chimed in and said, "They need to be put in a small room in the summertime that is not air conditioned and say, get on the ball and do something," and they do it. Again, you have the epistemology and the ontology all wrapped up with each other, and you get a picture of what the ideal politician, the ideal citizen technocratic politician would do, which is simply go out and try to solve the problems, go out and take action to solve the problems that are easy to solve, and therefore what the action is will be self-evident to them. But if that isn't what happens, in the sense that problems persist, then the naive technocratic realist is almost compelled to turn to an explanation such as corruption, conspiracies of special interests against the common interest, with the common interest meaning the interest in solving our fellow citizens' social and economic problems. And this corruption causes politicians not to really want to solve the problems, because instead they want to receive payoffs from special interests who don't want the problems to be solved. I think this explains the populist obsession with corrupt elites. I don't think it's so much the fact that they're elites, at least in the United States, that is the problem, as the fact that they're corrupt. I think that one way that this is illuminating is that a lot of political theorists who talk about populism tend to project onto populists the preoccupations of political theorists themselves, which is not very good intellectual charity practice. So they say that populists have this a priori commitment to the unity or the purity of the people, as if populists are theorists of popular sovereignty, is in the way that a lot of political theorists are. But in fact, I think, at least in the United States, that what is going on in the populist resistance to corrupt elites is not that they're trying to maintain the unity or purity of the people as a whole, as a single whole, but rather they're trying to resist the corrupt efforts of special interests to pay off political elites so that problems will not be solved. When Trump and his followers rail against the swamp of Washington, D.C., They're not saying that this fractures the unity of the people. They're saying that it interferes with the ability of the people and the people's elected representatives to solve our problems. Another implication of the, or sort of the flip side of conspiracy theorizing about political elites is the populist embrace of rich politicians, such as Trump, a billionaire, Perot, a billionaire, Berlusconi, a billionaire. Rich people don't need special interests, at least if you view what special interests do as simply providing payoffs so that the politician can have a higher standard of living. So if you elect a rich person, then you will be electing somebody who to some extent is immune from the nefarious interests of special interests, and that's all it takes to make sure that this politician will solve our problems, because now he or she won't be diverted from solving them by the need to do the bidding of the corrupt special interests. There's also a non-billionaire version, which is Bernie Sanders, who raised all his money from small donors and therefore assured everybody that he too would not be beholden to special interests. My favorite political epistemology quote of all time was written almost exactly 100 years ago by Walter Lippmann in his 1922 book, Public Opinion, in which he summed up the conspiracy mentality and its connection to naive technocratic realism, although he's not using the term technocracy or naive realism either. Lippmann wrote that one's political opponent presents himself as the man who says, "Evil, be thou my good." He is an annoyance who does not fit into the scheme of things. Nevertheless, he interferes. And since that scheme is based in our minds on incontrovertible fact, fortified by irresistible logic, some place has to be found for the opponent in our scheme. Rarely in politics or industrial disputes is a place made for him by the simple admission that he has looked upon the same reality as we have and seen another aspect of it. That would shake the whole scheme. Thus, out of the opposition, we make villains and conspiracies. In short, if the world is simple enough to be self-evident, then people who disagree with us can only be explained by being villains or conspirators. One upshot of this, I think, my fourth populist trait is intolerance. Why would you tolerate villains and conspirators? Toleration requires either something like a liberal deontological principle of toleration, which would have to be imported into the fundamentally consequentialist framework of technocracy. And it would sit there uneasily at odds with that consequentialism. Or it would require some kind of epistemic doubt or fallibilism. But epistemic doubt is ruled out by naive technocratic realism, where the truth is self-evident. So if you are a naive technocratic realist, you have no reason to tolerate villains and conspirators unless you somehow have been inculcated into a liberal deontological doctrine of toleration. Very quickly, the fifth, sixth, and seventh traits. The fifth one is the populist fondness for leaders who are belligerent and strong. Why do they need to be strong? I think they need to be strong so that they can, quote, fight, unquote. And what do they need to fight? They need to fight special interests. I'll just quickly give you a quotation from a Trump supporter the day after his election in 2016, who told a Wall Street Journal reporter that she was like her immigrant Philippine coworkers who favored Duterte. She said of them, they were tired of the corruption, and like me, they want someone who can get something done. Well, someone who is facing off against special interests may need to be belligerent and strong in order to get something done. I don't think that there's really any evidence that populists at least in the United States, have some kind of innate need for strength, a la the authoritarian personality theory, as opposed to simply working out the implications of their simplistic epistemology and ontology. Now, the last two, populist normlessness or lawlessness and populist nationalism, both of which are very important, I don't think that these really come from either the epistemology or the ontology, as opposed to the technocratic dimension of populism, namely consequentialism itself. Nationalism is an easy answer to the hard question of whose social and economic problems should we want to solve? And the answer is our fellow citizens. But nationalism is not something that's shared just by populists. Even the most elite technocrats at the Fed only are trying to solve the social, or in this case, the economic problems of Americans. And at all the other regulatory agencies, it's the social and economic problems of Americans that is their purview. This is just part of the taken for granted background culture of nationalism, of nation states, applied to technocracy. And as far as normlessness and lawlessness, I got at this a bit in discussing intolerance. If you are simply a consequentialist and you don't have an admixture of some foreign liberal or some non-simplistic fallibilism, then you view laws as means to the end of solving people's social and economic problems. So if laws or norms get in the way of solving those problems, you trample the laws and the norms. So that concludes the bulk of my remarks about populism. I just want to say two things in conclusion. One about non-technocratic forms of politics, and the other is back to intellectual charity as a method. Right now, I think what you see in the Democratic Party is a new form of politics. It's not brand new, but it's newly prominent in the US context, which for lack of a better term, I'll call radicalism. I think that the best way of understanding this radicalism, and this is a very, very brief sketch of it, is simply to say that it isn't consequentialist, and therefore it isn't technocratic. And the reason for that is that it is revolutionary. It is attempting to overthrow the entire status quo, which is seen to be unjust. It's not that the status quo produces social and economic problems, although these categories of my invention, like radicalism and technocracy, mix to each other in each person. So it's not as if the radical will deny that the status quo produces all sorts of social and economic problems. But basically, the radical is interested in injustice. And that's why the radical seeks a revolution. It's a revolution against an unjust status quo. So this puts it outside of technocratic politics as I've defined it. And yet radicalism can be quite intolerant. And there are several other parallels that you can draw between radicalism and populism. If you go through that list of 7 traits that I just gave, even though it isn't consequentialist. So that suggests that there is an epistemology of some kind and an ontology of some kind at work that isn't consequentialist, but that leads to, in some respects, similar outcomes as the epistemology and the ontology inside consequentialist populism. And this is just the kind of thing that an intellectually charitable investigation would be able to look into. And so now let me note, as I reach my final point about intellectual charity, that one of the benefits of intellectually charitable investigation, empirical investigation I'm talking about, is that it is inherently non-tendentious. When you say that somebody's behavior, their empirical behavior, can only be understood as irrational, you are being tendentious in the sense that you are saying, this person's crazy. There is no getting beyond the fact or around the fact that the judgment of craziness puts the social scientist in the position of disagreeing, to put it mildly, with the person that he or she is investigating or the beliefs or actions that he or she is trying to understand. Whereas if you are intellectually charitable, which rules out irrationalist explanations, then that doesn't rule in either that you agree or that you disagree with the person or the people you're investigating. So for example, you can think that intolerance, radical intolerance of racism, for example, is justified. That doesn't stop you, though, from investigating why the radical thinks that it's justified. It's just irrelevant whether you agree or disagree with it and find it justified or not. And therefore, you aren't from square one taking a position of opposition or of agreement with the person you investigate. So I would not quite go so far as to say that this allows the empirical researcher to be value-free, but it comes pretty close. We can get into that if anyone is interested. To give one more example that I'll close with, Critical Review is going to be publishing, has already begun to publish in dribs and drabs a symposium on my book. And I have people in the symposium disagreeing with me about all sorts of things, empirical matters and normative matters. I have them defending naive technocratic realism, for example, or defending the use of good intentions or politicians' bad intentions or their putative corruption as a way of understanding politicians' behavior. All of that is completely within the intellectually charitable framework that the book sets. In other words, we can disagree within that framework about the appropriateness of the actions that people take or the validity of the views that they hold. Now, if this method of interpretive or intellectual charity does allow us to illuminate something like populism in a new way, as I've suggested, that suggests in turn that a whole bunch of social science that has come before and has tried to investigate populism in intellectually uncharitable ways is at best quite beside the point. And I think that the implication follows that it's quite possible that a whole lot of social science research in general, maybe even most social science research, is beside the point. Because most social science research has to ignore people's ideas in an intellectually charitable way, at least. Part of this is methodological. Social scientists are taught that they're trying to come up with generalizations. And if you're trying to understand people's ideas, that will be particular to a group of people who, say, share a similar culture. And that means that your generalizations will only hold within that culture. You won't be coming up with universal regularities. And I think that is really the ultimate methodological implication, that social science should, as Weber taught, be historical. If it isn't historical, it's unscientific, because it is applying to a heterogeneous universe of people, the human race, findings that are only relevant to people who have certain ideas. But it's not just that we should be always only looking backward and not forward in the generalizations that we draw, or that we should just be particularistic rather than universalistic. I think it's also that the reason for these things is that we should be ideational and therefore intellectually charitable. The only way to understand people's ideas is to try to get inside their heads, intellectually charitably. And once you do that, you are dealing with a complex of assumptions, presuppositions, as I've tried to do here, that it's conceivable, it's logically possible that they will hold across all people in all cultures, but it seems to be highly improbable that it will.
Thank you very much, Jeff. That was a really fascinating presentation. And I think we've got a questioner in the queue already. So Irina, do you want to read the question out?
Yes, so we have a PhD candidate at the University of Pittsburgh. Question is, this is an incredibly interesting talk, thanks. I wonder whether it matters if these discourses are based on the politician's worldview or on reality. I mean, what if in a certain context, the majority of the political elite is indeed corrupt, or if the standard bureaucrat indeed follows public choice's self-interested ideal type? Should a politician speaking against these issues be classified as populist?
Well, there are two very different questions there. There's the question of how we classify the politician, and there's the question of the relationship between reality and perception. On the first or the second one, I don't think that reality really has anything to do with it if we aren't naive realists ourselves as social scientists. What we want to know is what people think about reality, not what reality itself is. That's the sense in which intellectually charitable investigation, empirical investigation, is non-tendentious. We don't have to take a position on whether they're right or wrong. We just have to understand why they think what they do. And unless we think that reality speaks to them directly, then the true nature of the reality that they are thinking about is irrelevant. What's relevant is cultural influence, broadly understood to include not just the kind of presuppositional culture I've been talking about, or logical implications of widely accepted practices, but explicit cultural teachings, what people learn in school, what they read in the newspaper, what they hear on CNN. And in evaluating the effect that that kind of cultural influence has on people's ideas and behavior, it seems to me quite irrelevant whether what they're hearing is true or false. As far as how to classify politicians, I'm not sure if the questioner is asking this question, but I'll just say that that one thing that I didn't have time to emphasize is the overlap between populist politics and ordinary non-populist politics. But one of what I think is an advantage of this particular technocratic interpretation of populism is that it shows that populism is not entirely other. All of us, or at least many of us who are not populist and would never vote for Donald Trump, say, engage in conspiracy theorizing. Many people who are not populist and would never vote for a populist politician think that the rich are conspiring, or that special interests are conspiring, or that, the public choice version of reality. It's not all that interesting to me whether we want to classify ourselves as social scientists who believe those things. Are public choice theorists populists? Actually, James Buchanan, I think, said that he was, but that's not really relevant. I think that the important point is that this category I've created, populism, like the category of technocracy, these are all social scientists or observers categories. It's not like people say to themselves, I'm a technocrat, so I'm going to believe certain things. I'm a populist, I'm going to believe certain things. They believe the things, and then we classify, we try to see the logic in what they believe, and we put labels on that logic. But I do think it's true, if this is what the questioner is suggesting, that both populists and non-populists believe many of the things that populists believe. And I think that that's what means that populism is a perennial feature of politics, at least in the United States. And at least as long as we have technocracy, it will be a perennial feature of politics. because it's drawing sustenance, it's drawing intellectual sustenance from ordinary non-populist assumptions, the assumptions that undergird citizen technocratic politics. So the line between a citizen technocrat and a populist citizen is simply going to be a fuzzy line about how strictly the populist adheres to the ideal type that I've constructed. But this is not a line that runs through reality. It's a line that runs through our categorizations of reality.
Thanks, Jeff. We have another question from John Meadowcroft. Jeffrey is convincing that populists are technocrats, but I wonder how this differentiates them from other politicians, i.e., do all politicians claim or try to solve social problems? It seems the point of differentiation might be how populists understand or define social problems. Perhaps that's the point.
I don't quite see the last point about how they define them. But I agree with the first point, as I was just saying in response to the previous question. Obama, who is widely considered in the United States to be perhaps the most technocratic president we've ever had, and there's a lot of, he did defer to social sciences a lot. He appointed probably the leading pro-technocracy or pro-epistocracy theorist of technocracy, Cass Sunstein, to head a regulatory agency, in fact. But he loved to say that the policies that he campaigned for or that he endorsed or was pushing were common sense solutions to people's problems. So I think that this overlap between non-populist politicians and populist politicians, as I said at the beginning of the talk, can be understood to flow from the fact that citizen technocracy is an application to technocratic issues of democratic presuppositions. If the people are qualified to vote in a technocracy, in other words, if they're qualified to vote about technocratic policies or about politicians who make technocratic claims, then the implication is that the people have access to technocratic knowledge, and that technocratic knowledge is going to be common sense. So as I said in response to the previous question, populism is us to the extent that we are Democrats and we believe that democracy should solve social and economic problems. I'll put it this way: the default in such a democracy is that everyone is a populist, but many people learn things from other strands of the culture. For example, they learn about radical interpretations of politics if they go to liberal arts college, or they learn about social science, or they read The Atlantic or the New York Times, which are very technocratic, or they learn somewhere about the need for tolerance. All these other intellectual influences on them can disrupt the default populism that they otherwise would have. One thing I didn't mention is that there is a lot of research, or at least there's some research on Trump voters as low information voters, meaning relatively politically ignorant voters, which suggests to me that they know relatively few things about politics, which means that they might just know the implications of what happens when you apply democratic assumptions to technocratic issues, but they haven't been highly educated on the whole, so they are unlikely to have learned other things that inject epistocratic elements into their technocratic views, or that inject non-technocratic views into their entire web of beliefs.
Jeff, I have a question that I think sort of follows up on the previous questions. So, I mean, I take from your remarks very much the idea that many problems, many social problems, but also I think also the issues of injustice that you mentioned at the end of the presentation, that the solutions to these issues are not self-evident in many cases. There are not demonstrably sort of obvious solutions. But the problem is there doesn't seem to be a kind of market for people who say that, and certainly not a market in politics for people who would say that. I mean, I've been struck very much, maybe other people have, I don't know, by what's happened with the response to the pandemic, that people seem to be absolutely certain of what the response should be. It's obvious that we should have had a lockdown earlier than we did, or it's obvious that we shouldn't have had a lockdown at all. The idea that, well, we're not sure what should happen, that it's not self-evident what the solution should be, isn't something that people seem to want to hear. And I mean, I just throw that out there. Is there a market for someone who says that it's not self-evident? And is there a way of creating such a market if it doesn't currently exist?
Well, I'm not sure I can fully answer the beginning of the question, but as for the end of it about the market, I don't think that economic reasoning is very illuminating when it comes to epistemological issues. Simply because people, it is impossible for people to have preferences over beliefs, as Brian Kaplan puts it. We cannot will ourselves to believe something, and we can't unwill ourselves from believing something that we already believe. We believe things on the basis of the evidence and reasoning that we've heard as we understand it. Oftentimes, this is even forgotten things that we've heard over a lifetime that colors how we receive new information. So it's not as if we are in the market for people who will sell us simplistic solutions if those are the ones that we find plausible. It's rather that our web of beliefs is such that it determines us to think that simplistic solutions are correct. So if we had a different culture that had filled our web of beliefs with more complicated ideas, then there would be a market for them. There would be a market for politicians who sold them. In a way, I think that, now this is a partial answer to the beginning of your question. I think that when, at least in the United States, the pro-lockdown side, I mean, all of this was conducted in the United States in the context of the Trump administration, about which people's views had already been very firmly fixed by the time the epidemic got underway. So everything was assimilated to, is Trump doing a bad job in the way that we would expect Trump to do a bad job given what we think we know about him from the previous 3 years. So the pro-lockdown people essentially seized on yes, it's simplistic, but in their mind, a simplistic solution to this massive social problem. But in their minds, it wasn't simplistic. In their minds, it was scientific. And the fact that Trump was increasingly opposed to lockdowns as time went on, said to them, or told them, sort of their web of beliefs told them that, okay, Trump as usual is resisting science. The scientists are saying lockdown. So it's simplistic to view the science that way. But most people don't. I mean, here's where the rubber hits the road as far as the involuntariness of our beliefs. Most people, I think, just aren't even aware of controversies among scientists. And so when scientists say the scientific consensus, or when journalists say the scientific consensus is X, people take that to mean the science is X. Most people are not philosophers of science, and so they don't recognize that a consensus is not necessarily correct. So science journalism and political journalism becomes a sort of poll taking among scientists. If the consensus of scientists who we interview is in favor of X, then that's what the science shows. This is an uncomplicated view, a simplistic view of science, and it's a simplistic. the nature of the simplism is that it views scientists as if they are not interpreters of the world, but direct recipients of unmediated evidence about the world, which they then just express in the form of their opinions. But I think that all of these ways of viewing science are cultural products. And for example, you have a problem with how simplistic things are portrayed in the lockdown debate. Presumably that's because you were exposed to different ideas. Perhaps you were exposed to some philosophy of science that made you realize how simplistic this is. Perhaps you were exposed to different fringy journalism that pointed out that not all epidemiologists agree, or that non-epidemiologists, who are nonetheless scientists, disagree with the consensus of epidemiologists. If there were more people like you, then there would be a market for something different.
All right, we have another question from Sam DeCanio. Jeff, do you have an explanation for why the conspiracy theories flourished in the US prior to the emergence of the idea that the state should serve as a problem-solving organization? For example, Hofstadter documented the history of conspiratorial theorizing stretching all the way back to the founding well before the progressive era. Do you think the contemporary administrative state and its vast scope and complexity changes how populism expresses itself?
Well, this is what I mean about the populism as the application of a pre-existing democratic framework to technocratic problems. But conspiracy theorizing, in a sense, stretches all the way back to Greek democracy. So now you could view that, I think, as technocracy stretching back, because all polities, all democratic polities, are in one sense or another trying to solve problems. And so if people disagree with you, or if people seem to you to have made an egregious mistake, then it seems to be natural to start conspiracy theorizing about them. So what that means at a theoretical level is simply that all the way back to ancient Greece, we have had people who have not been enlightened about the complexity of the world, so they oversimplify it. And in that light, how you define the historical boundaries of technocracy, whether it's simply coextensive with democracy or with any problem-solving regime, even if it's not democratic, that's a very interesting question. But I'm not saying that conspiracy theorizing started with technocracy, and I'm not even necessarily saying that technocracy aggravated this pre-existing tendency toward conspiracy theorizing. That's an empirical question that I just don't have any information about, but it's the kind of thing that that I think intellectually charitable empirical investigators like Sam himself can look into, or Sam himself, his book did look into that.
All right, I think actually we're out of questions. If anybody wants to type in something, now's the chance. Otherwise, I think we will have to end it.
I have another question that while we're waiting to see if other people can come in with other questions. But I really wanted to ask, this is a kind of cultural explanation, it seems to me, that you're offering, Jeff, that there's something in the culture that people are seeing problems in a certain way, that it's about the webs of belief that they have, the way they approach problems. And that really raises the question of, well, where does this culture come from of seeing problems in this way? What is the historical sort of genesis of these kind of beliefs? I mean, are you aware of work that's going on at the moment that tries to get at where this culture comes from? So a culture, I guess, which is about looking for simple solutions to social problems.
Well, I'm very glad you asked that question, because when back at the beginning of the presentation, I mentioned that I was just going to focus on one explanation for the for naive technocratic realism and the ontology of a simple society that follows from it. And that's a cultural explanation. But what I didn't say is that you could, in principle, view this, there's another explanation which is still cultural, but it's sort of cultural by default. So in this view, which would ultimately have to be traceable, I think, to something like evolutionary epistemology, you would say, look, people have no reason not to think that they can solve whatever problem they confront. In other words, our genes are such that we have modules for thinking that we can solve problems or something like that. So it's not as if they have to be indoctrinated with the view that social problems are simple to solve, or the view that ordinary people without social scientific training can solve these problems. Or, for that matter, I haven't really talked much about epistocracy. The other view, which is that neoclassical economic theory gives us the knowledge, the technocratic knowledge we need, or that learning advanced statistical techniques gives us that knowledge. All of these are positive cultural inputs, but it could be that the default that people have, even if they had no cultural inputs at all, would be, okay, that's the problem, let's solve it. Or, okay, I look around me, I see the social world, meaning I see other people. And even if I don't have the concept of society, I can solve social problems by thinking about how other people are likely to react if we do a certain thing. I mean, it's very hard to imagine a completely acultural person for the purpose of ideal typical theorizing, but if you try to imagine that, I think you could say that it would simply be an uncultural default to view people as simple, to view the problems people cause as simple, even to view society as simple, even though obviously the notion of society is a culturally mediated invention concept. So you could go in that non-cultural direction, but I think that even if that is the case, that there is a default setting in favor of simplicity and therefore in favor of thinking that we can successfully solve any given problem. It's an empirical reality that we do receive all sorts of cultural inputs that either leads to a simplistic version of technocracy or to an epistocratic version of technocracy. And these, in the case of the simplistic conclusions, we would have to say that they're overdetermined. There may be a default setting that's reinforced by the practices of democracy and the teachings that when people are taught that they should have opinions, that they're capable of having reliably accurate opinions about the proposals made by kitchen table politicians, when people are told that they should be informed voters, meaning they should read the newspaper or an online equivalent of a newspaper. The reason that I would emphasize that cultural overdetermination, even if there's this underlying non-cultural default setting, is that it's very easy to overcome a default setting like that. All you have to do is be introduced to the idea that, hey, the world is complex. So if it's a module, it's a very pliable module. And that, I think, is what explains the power of culture and the incredible diversity of culture. People believe all sorts of different religious ideas, all sorts of different political ideas. Whatever the default settings are, perhaps we should understand them as creating very broad parameters around a gigantic universe of particular ideas that people might believe. Those particularities are determined culturally. And in cases where they overlap with the default setting, that will amount to an overdetermination of a tendency in favor of that default setting. But it doesn't take much, I don't think, to overcome any of these default settings with a dose of culture. And what that means at a theoretical level is that obviously we have a very powerful evolutionary module, as it were, for culture. And that module has the power to override many, if not all, other modules that may give us default settings. But we can easily be talked out of those default settings. So I think that probably it would be more productive if you want to understand the actual ideas that particular people have, to focus on culture rather than evolution.
Thanks very much. We have another question from Paul Gunn. I wonder if I may ask, it seems to me that Jeff's argument is a modern sequel to Weber's argument about the iron cage. We are now caught in the iron cage of technocracy. Of course, Weber thought that political leadership might provide a route out, but is the implication of technocratic populism, the total victory of rationalistic views of the world in our politics, that this kind of leadership is essentially impossible?
Maybe Paul can chat you an answer to this question. Oh, I see his question here. But to clarify that, a route out. By a route out, do you mean a route to good, sound technocratic reasoning, or do you mean a route out of any kind of technocratic reasoning at all? I mean, I could cover both possibilities and answer. I don't
have a go at both.
I don't think there's any out of technocratic reason in general, I suppose. Well, if we decide we don't want to solve people's social and economic problems, that would be the end of that. I'm not sure that would be a very rational conclusion, though, because whatever we do, and even if we don't do anything, we are going to be affecting people's social and economic problems. Inaction is therefore a kind of action. So whether we're aware of it or not, or whether we are willing to admit it or not, we are going to be acting as if we are technocrats, good ones or bad ones, meaning technocrats who help other people, or technocrats who hurt other people. So in that sense, I don't think there's any way out of technocratic reason or out of technocracy. I mean, the normative aspect of my book is about to what extent, if any, there are ways of being better and worse technocrats. And I say there, in a kind of normative parallel to what I said at the end of my talk here, that I do think that we can be better technocrats, so in that sense, more rational technocrats, if we pay attention to people's ideas. Not in the sense that I'm doing in this talk, where I'm paying attention to people's ideas in their capacity as technocrats, but if we pay attention to people's ideas in their capacity as the objects of technocratic action. When technocrats, whether it's an economist designing, say, a minimum wage law, or an ordinary citizen deciding whether he's in favor of the minimum wage or raising the minimum wage to $15 an hour. What they are both doing is they are trying to predict how employers will react to a minimum wage of $15 an hour. If we just ignore the ideas, the fact that the employers have to process this new element of their environment through ideas and interpret how they should respond to them, I think we're likely to do a worse job than if we think of employers as having ideas and as interpreting the world. And in general, I think that we may be able to make some progress. I don't know how much. That's a different, interesting theoretical issue. But we can make some progress toward being better technocrats if we recognize that people are ideational creatures, both as technocrats themselves and as objects of technocratic coercion. if we understand each other better, in other words, we are able to predict each other better, which is why we're so much better able to predict the behavior of the people we know very well compared to the people we've never met. And unfortunately, it's the people who they've never met who are usually the objects of technocratic control. So to the extent that they can get to know them better through ideationally sensitive methods of social science, they might become better technocrats who do more good than harm, or who do relatively more good than they would have done otherwise. So, but for that reason, I really think that the normative implication of my book is not so much institutional as it is cultural. In two senses. First, we really would require a cultural revolution. I don't want to press too hard on that, the historical resonance of that. But a massive change in the ideas held by technocrats, both citizen technocrats and epistocrats, in order to get them to treat other people as complicated ideational beings who they need to understand. Because that just is not the way social science is set up, as I briefly said at the end. And it's not the way that ordinary people's understanding is set up. The bigger sense is that this implies a kind of humanism where we understand the human to be the ideational, the essential feature of humanity. It is sort of reason, in the sense that I think that we must understand other people as rational, which is how we understand ourselves. But an implication of that type of rationalistic humanism is understanding other people as ideational creatures, which has all sorts of implications. But one of them is they are fallible creatures, because our ideas are not direct reflections of reality. They're mediated by culture, meaning mediated by human interpretation, and therefore prone to some degree of error. So a humanism of this sort would both, meaning a recognition of the ideational and fallible nature of humanity, would both help to improve technocracy to some indeterminate degree, but would also seem to be called for to the extent that we just want to think better, more accurately about the nature of us as beings.